They called him broken, useless, half a man. When Elias Crow rolled his wheelchair off that train, the woman who sent for him took one look and spit out the word disabled like it was poison. Then she rode away, leaving him stranded in the snow as the whole town watched. But this is not where his story ends. This is where it begins. Stick around, because what happened next in the small town of Red Willow will change how you see strength forever. Elias had spent his last dollar on that train ticket. 3 years ago, a mine collapse took his legs but left him with a sharp mind and hands that could build or fix anything. He came to Red Willow answering an ad from a widow, Adelaide Pritchard, who needed a husband to help run her ranch. He had been honest in his letter, mentioning he used a wheeled chair for mobility. Her reply was short: arrival acceptable. February 14th. He allowed himself to hope. That was his first mistake. The moment his chair hit the platform, her face went from hopeful to cold stone. "You cannot even stand," she said, her voice cutting through the freezing air. He tried to explain that his skills were in his hands and his head, but she would not hear it. "I advertise for a whole man," she told him, then turned her back and left him in the biting wind, his hope turning to dust. Just as shame began to settle in, a large man with a leather apron stepped forward. His name was Jed, the town blacksmith. Jed had not seen a cripple. He saw the master craftsmanship in the steel braces and clever breaks of Elias's chair. "Looks like you know your way around a forge," Jed said, offering a hand not in pity, but in respect. He offered Elias a warm room in exchange for help in his shop. It was a small kindness that felt like a lifeline. Elias went to work, his hands remembering the feel of hot steel and the satisfaction of a job well done. A few weeks later, a crisis hit Red Willow. The main pump for the town's water well broke down. A vital gear had shattered, and the part was weeks away by train. The town was facing disaster. Jed and the other men were stumped. But Elias looked at the broken pieces, took measurements, and saw the solution. He spent 2 days at the forge, working with a focus and skill that left Jed speechless. He did not just copy the old gear, he improved the design. By the third day, the town pump was working better than ever. Elias was no longer the disabled man from the train. He was the engineer who saved the town. Meanwhile, Adelaide Pritchard's ranch was failing. That same winter storm had damaged her irrigation system, and she was too proud to ask for help from the man she had shamed. Word of her troubles reached Elias. The town now looked to him, and he did something no one expected. He designed a new, stronger headgate for her main irrigation ditch, one that would not break under pressure. He gave the plans to Jed. "Build this for her," he said. "The town depends on her ranch surviving." Adelaide was stunned when the new part arrived. She was even more humbled when Jed told her who had designed it. She rode into town and stopped in front of the blacksmith shop. She found Elias not broken, but covered in the soot and sweat of honest work, a respected man. She apologized, the words catching in her throat, and tried to pay him. Elias refused her money. "Your apology is payment enough," he said. He had found something better than a marriage of convenience. He had found a home, and everyone in Red Willow learned a valuable lesson that day. A person's true worth is not measured by what they have lost, but by what they choose to build with what they have left. It was a raw deal from the start. A woman, Mrs. Pritchard, had the decency to look ashamed as she explained the situation to Elias. "The fault is partly mine, Mr. Crow," she said, her voice unsteady. "I should have been more clear." She offered to pay his way back to Denver, but Elias cut her off with a firm, "That will not be necessary." She seemed shocked. "But there is nothing for you here in Red Willow," she insisted. "Not in your condition." There was that phrase again, his condition, as if his life in a wheelchair was a new tragedy, not something he had mastered for 3 long years. "I will find something," he said. Mrs. Pritchard tried to offer him money for the trouble, but his sharp no stopped her cold. For a brief second, he saw a flicker of respect in her eyes before she hardened her expression. She wished him luck, then turned and walked away to a wagon, never once looking back. The crowd on the station platform drifted away, the free show now over. Some folks offered pitying looks, while others pretended not to see him at all. Elias sat perfectly still, his hands on the wheels of his chair. The train was about to leave, giving him one last chance to return to Denver, a city of dead-end jobs and extra rent for a ground-floor room. Or he could stay in this empty town that had already rejected him. The train whistle screamed its final call. With quiet resolve, Elias turned his chair away from the tracks. He was staying. A station master walked over. "Train is leaving, son. Are you staying or going?" Elias looked him square in the eye. "I am staying." The old man's expression made it clear he thought Elias was making a huge mistake. "There is a boarding house run by a Mrs. Chen," the station master said. "But," he trailed off, looking at the 3 wooden steps leading down from the platform. "But I would need to get there first," Elias finished for him. He wheeled over to inspect the steps. They were heavy, but not bolted down. A small surprise. "Are these steps removable?" he asked. The station master blinked, confused. "I can build a ramp," Elias declared, seeing a solution where the other man only saw a problem. "If you have some wood, I will do it for free." The man looked at him like he was crazy. Elias decided to press his advantage. "There is a law requiring a railroad wheelchair ramp at public stations," he said with complete confidence. The station master hesitated. "I would have to check." "It will be done before the evening train," Elias promised. "If the railroad objects, they can tear it down." The train whistled one last time and began to pull away. The station master finally nodded. "Maintenance shed is around back," he mumbled. "You break it, you buy it." The train disappeared into the distance, and with it, Elias's easy way out. He felt a mix of fear and freedom. In the shed, he found everything he needed: lumber, nails, a hammer, and a saw. As the winter sun began to set, Elias finished his work. The ramp was sturdy, perfectly angled, and wide enough for his chair. A few townspeople had stopped to watch, including an older man in a blacksmith's apron who stayed the whole time. "Do you know anything about brake mechanisms?" the blacksmith asked. It was another surprise, a potential opportunity. "I know some. Why do you ask?" Elias replied, gathering his tools. The blacksmith, Tom Birch, explained he had a freight wagon with a brake that always sticks in the cold. "I am better with horseshoes than machines," he admitted. "I will pay you $2 if you can fix it." $2. Elias had exactly $11.30 in the entire world. That money was a lifeline. "I would need to see it first," Elias said, ever the professional. Tom told him the smithy was on 2nd Street, easy to find. He then walked off, a man of few words. Later, Elias found Mrs. Chen's boarding house. The front steps were impossible, so he found a service entrance in the back alley. He knocked on the door. It was opened by a small, sharp-eyed Chinese woman who took one look at him and said, "No beggars." I am not begging," Elias stated calmly. "I need a room and I can pay." Mrs. Chen studied him, her face revealing nothing. "How long?" she asked. "A few days to start," he replied. $1 a day, breakfast included. Payment in advance. Her rules were simple and direct. Elias counted out $3, leaving him with a terrifyingly small $8.30. She took the money and led him to a room on the ground floor. It was hardly bigger than a closet, with just a bed, a small table, and a single window facing the alley. It was a room for someone who was not expected to stay. "Breakfast is at 6:30, she said from the doorway. "If you are late, you do not eat." As she turned to leave, she paused. "That woman at the station," she began, her sharp eyes studying him once more. "That woman was a fool to leave you," Mrs. Chen said. Elias glanced up, startled. "A fool to judge a man by his legs." She explained that when she first came to America, people judged her for everything. They told her she was less than nothing. She spent 30 years proving them all wrong. She looked him square in the eye and said, "Now you can prove them wrong too, or you can sit in this room. The choice is yours." With that, she left. Elias listened to the normal sounds of life in the boarding house, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. His plan had been simple: meet the widow, get the gourmand, and build a new life. It was a good plan for a whole man. But on the train platform, Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard had announced to the whole town that he was not a whole man. The whispers and stares had told him the same thing for 3 long years. "You are broken. You are less." He closed his eyes and saw the mine. He had been 24 years old and strong. He had a girl named Sarah with red hair and a wonderful laugh. They were going to get married and buy some land. Then a support beam in Tunnel 6 collapsed. 3 days later, a doctor told him he was lucky to be alive, but some things could not be fixed. Sarah visited him one time. She cried and said she was sorry, and then he never saw her again. His father sent a letter that said, "Come home when you can work again." So Elias learned how to work again. He built his own chair and found ways to do any job that did not require standing. But people only ever saw the chair. They saw the damage, not the man. A soft knock brought him back to the present. The door opened, and a young man brought in a tray of food. "I am Daniel," the young man said. "Mrs. Chen sent this." He set down the soup and bread. "I saw what happened with Mrs. Pritchard at the station. That was a rough thing to see. In a town this small, news travels fast." Daniel hesitated, then added, "For what it is worth, she has been running that ranch by herself for 2 years. She is as hard as nails. If she could not see your value, that is her loss," he continued. "Tom Birch is already telling folks about the ramp you built at the station. He said it was the smartest piece of building he had seen in years." Daniel smiled. "Anyway, welcome to Red Willow. This place has potential. You will see." After Daniel left, Elias ate his soup. He thought about second chances and how a rejection might not be the end of the story. The town was indifferent to him, which meant he could build a new life right here. The next morning, Elias wheeled himself into the dining room. The 6 other boarders stopped talking when he entered. He found a place at the table, trying to ignore the sudden silence. Mrs. Chen appeared with a coffee pot. "Eggs and bacon," she said. "Eat up. The kitchen closes in 20 minutes. A traveling salesman looked him over and finally spoke. "You are the man from the station yesterday, are you not?" "That is right," Elias said. The salesman, whose name was Lloyd Hutchkins, shook his head. "It is a shame," he said loudly. "A man in your condition trying to do ranch work. It is just not practical." The other men at the table mumbled in agreement. Elias finished his breakfast in silence, feeling their pity and judgment. He knew then that Mrs. Pritchard was not the only person in Red Willow he would have to prove wrong. Outside, the blacksmith, Tom Birch, stopped him on the street. "Do not mind Lloyd," he said. "He has a big mouth and a small mind. This town can be slow to accept new things." "That was a heck of a thing for Mrs. Pritchard to do, just leaving you high and dry," the salesman said, shaking his head. "What were you thinking, coming all this way for a mail-order job in your shape?" Before Elias could answer, Daniel, who'd been quiet at the other end of the table, slammed his fork down. "Maybe he was thinking he's a skilled man looking for honest work. Same as anyone else. Now pass the salt." The sudden tension vanished, but Elias felt a flicker of gratitude for the unexpected defense. He gave Daniel a slight nod. After breakfast, Elias wheeled himself down 2nd Street toward Tom Birch's smithy. The cold air bit at his face. Folks on the street mostly stepped aside, though a few stared. He found the smithy easily, drawn by the ring of a hammer on steel and the warmth pouring from its wide-open doors. The place smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. Tom Birch hammered a glowing piece of iron, not stopping until it was shaped just right. He plunged it into a water barrel with a loud hiss and finally turned to Elias. "Wasn't sure you'd make it," Tom said. "You offered pay and work." "Of course I made it." Tom pointed with his thumb toward a freight wagon with a wheel missing. "Brakes on the rear axle are seized up. Gets dangerous on the hills when it freezes." Elias rolled over and took a look. It was a standard lever system, but the pivot was rusted solid. "You got a wire brush and some kerosene?" he asked. Tom nodded. "Think you can fix it?" Elias replied, "First, I got to take it apart and see what I'm working with." For 2 hours, Elias took the brake apart, cleaned every piece of rust and grime, and straightened a bent lever arm on Tom's anvil. He put it all back together, but instead of oil, he used a fine graphite powder. "Give it a try," Elias said. Tom worked the brake lever. It moved smooth as silk. He tried it again, harder, and it was still perfect. He looked at Elias with new respect. "How'd you know to use graphite?" Elias wiped grease from his hands. "Oil gets gummy in the cold and attracts moisture, which means more rust. Graphite doesn't freeze and it keeps the water out." Tom gave the lever one more test, then nodded. $2, just like I said. But I have another question for you. You looking for steady work or just passing through?" Elias thought for a moment. Steady work meant staying in a town that had already rejected him once, but it also meant survival. "I could use steady work," he said. Tom explained, "I get a lot of repair jobs I don't have time for." Pay is not great, maybe $8 or $10 a week, but it's regular. You'd work right here. The only thing is, some folks might not want to do business with a smith that has you working here. I'll take the work, Elias said without hesitation. Tom stuck out a hand. Then we have a deal. Be here at 7 tomorrow. Elias took his $2 and wheeled out into the cold, a glimmer of hope in his chest. That hope lasted about half a block. Hey! A voice yelled from across the street. Elias ignored it. You deaf as well as crippled? I'm talking to you. Elias stopped and saw a heavy-set man in a shopkeeper's apron glaring at him. You the one Adelaide Pritchard sent for? The man shouted, drawing a small crowd. I am, Elias said, keeping his voice calm. The man sneered. Heard she sent you packing the second she saw you. Smart woman. We don't need damaged goods in this town. Elias started to wheel away. I've got work to do. But the man stepped into the street, blocking his path. It is rude to just wheel away when someone is talking to you. And it is rude to yell insults at a stranger, Elias replied. But here we are. You planning to stay in Red Willow? The man demanded. Because we do not need another charity case. Lloyd, that is enough. A new voice cut through the air. It was Tom Birch walking up the street with a hammer still looped in his belt. The man has a right to be here, Lloyd scoffed. You hiring him, Tom? That is a mistake. Nobody will do business with you. I guess we will find out, Tom said, his voice low and firm. Now some of us have work to do. Lloyd hesitated, then stepped back with a huff. Fine, but do not say I did not warn you. He shot Elias one last dirty look before storming back into his store. Tom stood beside Elias for a moment. That's Lloyd Hutchkins, he said. He likes the sound of his own voice. Elias looked from Tom to the general store. He knew he was in for a fight, but for the first time he knew he would not be fighting it alone. It takes time for folks to get used to someone who is different, but they come around if you stick it out. The question is, are you planning to stick it out? Elias looked at the town that had already turned him away once. He could take his money and leave, start over somewhere new. But he had been starting over for 3 years. At some point, a man had to make a stand. Yes, he said, I am planning to stick it out. Tom nodded. Good. Come to my shop tomorrow at 7. My wife packs too much lunch. Elias needed supplies, but instead of going to the main general store run by Lloyd Hutchkins, he went 2 blocks down to a smaller shop that read Chen's Goods. If Mrs. Chen ran a boarding house, perhaps she had other businesses as well. Inside, a young woman with a neat braid stood behind the counter. Can I help you, she asked. Are you related to Mrs. Chen from the boarding house? She is my mother. I am Mei Chen. Your mother told me I should prove people wrong, Elias said. I am here to buy supplies to get started. Mei Chen's expression softened with curiosity. You are the one Mrs. Pritchard rejected. My mother mentioned you. She said you have determination. She does not say that about very many people. What do you need? Elias bought paper, pencils, a lantern, and oil. It cost him 80 cents. May wrapped his items but did not try to help him. She just handed him the package with the same thoughtful look her mother had given him. Lloyd Hutchkins is telling people you are a charity case who cannot work, she said quietly. Is that true? I just fixed Tom Birch's freight wagon, Elias replied. You can ask him if I can work. I am asking you, she said. Elias met her gaze. I can work, he stated. I can build, repair, and create anything that does not require a man to stand. And I can usually find a way around that too. May nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. Mrs. Chen's advice was simple. This town needs workers, not whiners, she said. And Lloyd Hutchkins is a fool. Don't let him speak for the rest of us. As Elias wheeled away from her shop, he noticed a woman watching him from across the street. She was not staring with pity like most folks. She was sizing him up. Their eyes locked for a second before she turned and disappeared down an alley. The ride back to his room was cold enough to numb his face. That evening, he warmed himself by the stove and started sketching plans on a piece of paper. He was designing a better wheelchair, one that was lighter and tougher, because if you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself. A knock on the door pulled him from his work. It was Daniel, the young man who helped at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen sent Stu, he said, then hesitated. There is also a woman here to see you, a Miss Martha Hale. She says she has a job for you. Elias put his pencil down. Send her in. The visitor was the woman from the street. Up close, her face was worn from work, and her hands were rough. She got right to the point. "Mr. Crow, I am Martha Hale. I own the laundry. I saw the ramp you built at the station, and Tom Birch says you are a good man with your hands. I need a ramp for my own porch." "Tom does not give praise lightly," Martha added. "I can pay $2 for the work, and I have the lumber already." Elias studied her. This was not a handout. It was a real job offer. He agreed to look at the porch the next day. Martha then placed $2 on a small table. "Half now, half when the work is done," she said firmly, pushing the coins toward him. "A man should not work if he does not know he will be paid." As she was leaving, she paused. "I heard what Lloyd Hutchkins said. He is a cheat who mistreats his own wife. He has no business judging any other person's worth." Then she looked him straight in the eye. "Some people here will only see your chair," she told him. "The ones that matter will see your work. You just worry about them." She left, and Elias sat looking at the $2. It felt like a chance, a sign that he could build a life here. The next day at the blacksmith shop, he worked hard and well, earning Tom's quiet approval. At lunchtime, Tom's wife Irene brought them food. "Tom said you figured out that wagon problem in 5 minutes," she said with a bright smile. "If he says you are good, then you are good." Irene told him Mrs. Chen had come to town with nothing and built a life by being stubborn. "You will do just fine here if you have that same grit," she said. At 4 o'clock, Elias made his way to the laundry. He saw the 3 steep steps to the front porch and knew right away why Martha needed his help. Lifting heavy laundry baskets up those steps all day would break a person's back. Martha came out to meet him. "You made it," she said. "I keep my word," Elias answered. She showed him the back porch and the lumber. "I have to be able to roll my cart up here," she explained. "Carrying everything by hand is just too hard." "Everything by hand, and these steps are just breaking my back." Elias looked it over. "I can build a ramp for that cart," he offered, "with sides, so it won't slip off." Martha looked skeptical. "I'll have it done by tomorrow evening," he promised, "on one condition. You let me test it with my chair first. If I can get up it, your cart surely will." Her face softened a little. "That seems fair." Elias got to work right away. He spent the rest of that day and the next morning making precise cuts and building a sturdy ramp. He added the side rails and sanded the whole thing smooth, making sure no splinters would catch the wheels. All the while, Martha went about her work, never bothering him, but watching his progress with a quiet, measuring gaze. When it was done, Elias rolled his chair up and down it 3 times. The ramp was solid as a rock. "All right," he said, "your turn." Martha loaded her cart with laundry and pushed it up the ramp. It rolled up as smooth as butter. She added another basket, and it was still easy. "It is perfect," she said, looking at him with newfound respect. Elias took the dollar she owed him. "You do good work, Elias," she said. "I have other things that need fixing, if you are interested." That ramp was the start of something. Elias spent his mornings at the smithy and his afternoons doing odd jobs all over town. He fixed things for the doctor, the school teacher, and a rancher who paid him $3 without a second glance at his chair. The work was steady, and he started saving up for his own tools. He and Martha would see each other around the small town of Red Willow. They would nod, maybe say a quick hello, and that was all. Until the day a loud crash from an alley caught his attention. He wheeled around the corner and found Martha on the ground, her hand pressed to her face with blood seeping through her fingers. An overturned laundry basket lay beside her. "Martha," he said, rushing over. He could see a nasty gash above her eye. "I am fine," she insisted. "Just tripped with the basket." "You are bleeding quite a bit for someone who is fine," Elias said, moving closer. "You need to get that cleaned." She just sat there in the dirt, looking completely worn out. "Let me help you," he said gently. He expected her to refuse, but after a long moment, she gave a single, tired nod. Elias pulled out his clean handkerchief, wet it with his canteen, and carefully cleaned the cut. It was not too deep, but head wounds always bleed a lot. He held the cloth against the wound with steady pressure. "What really happened?" he asked. "I was carrying the basket and just lost my footing," she said, though her sagging shoulders told a different story. "When was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" "I sleep," she said evasively. "I have been working until midnight and starting again at 5 in the morning. I am just tired." You cannot work yourself into the ground, he said. Says the man who works 2 jobs, she replied with a faint smile. He kept pressure on the cut until the bleeding finally slowed. Come on, he said. We need to get you to a doctor. Dr. Kim charges 50 cents just to look at you. Good thing I just got paid $3 for that wagon axle then. Let us go. To his surprise, she did not argue. She let him help her up, and they walked down the street together, an unlikely pair. People stared, but Elias had long since stopped caring about that. The doc cleaned her up for 40 cents, which Elias paid before she could protest. Why are you so kind? She asked him on the walk back. He saw a familiar hurt in her eyes. You were kind to me first, he said. You saw past this chair. A quiet understanding passed between them. Back at her laundry, she pointed toward the door. I have some soup on. You are welcome to join me. He thought of his lonely room, then nodded. I would like that very much. For the first time, Elias felt he might be finding a place here. The soup was just potatoes and pork, but it was warm. They ate in her small kitchen behind the main laundry room. How long have you run this place? He asked. 3 years since my husband passed, she said plainly. His freight wagon went off the road in a storm. He left me this building and $60 in debt, she said, gathering their bowls. His drinking gave me a bad reputation, too. After he died, some folks blamed me for it. Elias understood the weight of unfair judgment. That is not right, he said. Fairness has little to do with it, she replied, turning to face him. People need someone to blame. You know about that, do you not? He nodded. Which makes me wonder, she continued, why did you stay here after Mrs. Pritchard ran you off? I have been running for 3 years, Elias admitted, moving from town to town. I decided it was time to stop running and make my stand. Make people see what I can do, not what I cannot. How is that working out? She asked. He saw her first smile. Ask me in 6 months. A sharp knock on the door broke the spell. Martha's face hardened as she opened it. Mrs. Pritchard, she said flatly. Elias tensed. I need my laundry tonight, the woman demanded from the doorway. It will be ready tomorrow, as I told you. Martha's voice was firm. Poor planning on your part is not an emergency for me. All my customers are important. Mrs. Pritchard threatened to take her business somewhere else. That is your choice, Martha replied coolly. The woman huffed and finally agreed to pick it up by noon the next day. After closing the door, Martha looked at Elias a little embarrassed. That must be awkward, with her being the one who... She trailed off. The one who called me unfit? Elias finished. My business is with you, not her. Your ramp still needed to be built. I do not waste energy on grudges, he told her. But she is important in this town, Martha warned. People will listen to her. Then let them listen, Elias said. I can only control my own work. As he wheeled his chair to leave, she stopped him. Elias, thank you again for the doctor. He simply nodded and left. Over the next few weeks, life found a rhythm. He worked at the Smithy and took on repair jobs, earning enough to get by and beginning a quiet friendship with Martha. You would think folks in a small town would look out for each other, but sometimes a man's greed can poison the whole well. One morning, the door to Tom's smithy flew open. It was Daniel, breathless and worried. He said Lloyd Hutchkins was at the general store telling everyone that Martha Hale owed him $40. He was even showing the sheriff a ledger, claiming she cheated him on laundry supplies. I knew right then it was a lie. Martha was as honest as the day is long, and she always paid her way. But a lie can travel fast in a town that's watching you, and folks were already starting to whisper. If you believe a good person should never have to stand alone against a bully, then you know we had to do something, and do it fast. Tom threw his hammer down, his face turning hard as iron. He told me the real story. Last summer, Lloyd had too much to drink and cornered Martha outside a town dance. When he put his hands on her, she slapped him so hard it left a mark for a week. This whole thing was not about money. It was Lloyd's cruel way of getting revenge. Hearing that, a fire lit inside me. I did not wait to hear another word. I pushed my chair out the door and down the street. The frozen ruts in the road nearly threw me, but I just pushed harder, fueled by a rage I did not know I had. I found her laundry closed up tight. She was sitting on the back steps, looking completely broken. He is going to take everything, she whispered. She explained that Lloyd showed the sheriff a ledger with her name and fake entries for credit. She had always paid cash, but Lloyd never gave her receipts. She said, "It is my word against a respected businessman. Who are they going to believe?" She felt the whole game was rigged against people like us from the very start. I sat there for a minute, the cold biting at my skin, and knew she was right. The game was rigged. So I decided we were not going to play by his rules. I looked her straight in the eye and asked, "Where does Lloyd keep that ledger?" A spark of hope, or maybe fear, flickered in her eyes. I told her to stay put and not talk to anyone. Then I wheeled over to Mrs. Chen's shop. I explained the situation, how Lloyd was using a ledger without ever giving receipts. Mrs. Chen, a woman sharper than a needle, understood immediately. She said, "In this country, if you do not have paper proof, people say you are lying. Lloyd Hutchkins is a pig who thinks he is better than everyone." She knew that proving Lloyd was a liar was the only way to save Martha. Her daughter May brought out a wooden box. It was filled with 3 years of customer receipts, all organized by name and date. "Show them what an honest business looks like," Mrs. Chen said. With that box, I had more than just hope. I had a weapon. I went back to Martha and found her scrubbing clothes like she was trying to wash away the whole world. I put the box on a crate beside her. "We are going to the sheriff," I said, "and we are going to show him the difference between a liar's ledger and a good woman's honor." And we did. In front of the whole town, we proved Lloyd was a cheat. His reputation was ruined, and Martha's name was cleared. That day we learned that when a game is rigged, you don't just play along. You stand together and change the rules. Elias pointed to the box he had brought. "What is that?" Martha asked. 3 years of receipts from Chen's store," he said. "It is proof that good folks give receipts when you pay cash." He then explained that Tom Birch, the school teacher, and Dr. Kim would all swear she paid her bills. Martha just stared. "You have been talking to people about me?" "I have been gathering proof that Lloyd Hutchkins is a liar," Elias corrected her gently. "Martha, you said fighting is no good if the game is rigged. But sometimes you have to fight it anyway. The only other choice is letting men like Lloyd decide what you are worth." She thought about the risk. She thought about the cost. Finally, she looked at him and said, "What do you need me to do?" He replied, "I need you to let me help you, and I need you to trust me." The next morning, they went to the general store with Tom Birch right behind them. The store was full of people. Lloyd saw them coming and a nasty smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here, the widow and her crippled husband. Have you come to beg?" Elias's voice was calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "We came to talk about your ledger, Lloyd, about the money you claim Martha owes you." "There is nothing to talk about." "She owes me $38.50, Lloyd snapped. "That is interesting," Elias said. "Martha says she always paid you in cash." Lloyd laughed. "A woman's memory can be a faulty thing." "Does that happen to men too?" Elias asked. "Because Tom here says you never give him receipts, and neither does Chen's shop or the doctor." Elias pulled a stack of papers from a bag on his chair. "In fact, we have talked to 24 of your customers. Not a single one has ever gotten a receipt from your store." The laughter in the room stopped cold. "That is a serious thing to say, boy," Lloyd growled, taking a step closer. "I am saying your ledger is not proof of anything," Elias continued. "You admit you do not give receipts, so there is no way to check if your book is honest." "The sheriff believes my ledger, but Lloyd shot back. "Did the sheriff know this is not the first time you have done this?" Elias asked, holding up another paper. "We found 3 other times you took people to court over debts, and all you had for proof was your own ledger." Lloyd's face turned beet red. The entire store was silent. Every customer was watching him. Lloyd knew he was losing. "It does not change the fact that she owes me money," he sputtered. "A ledger says whatever you want it to say," Martha cut in, her voice steady and strong. "Just like your books probably say you are balanced when you skim money from your own register." Lloyd's face went from red to purple. "You will regret that." "Will I?" Martha took a step forward. "I hear things in my laundry, Lloyd, things about money that does not add up. I reckon a territorial auditor would be very interested in your real books." Tom Birch's voice boomed. "An audit could tie up your business for a month or two, but if you have nothing to hide, that should not be a problem." Lloyd stood there, trapped by his own lies as the whole store watched. Or, Elias said quietly, you could admit your ledger was a mistake, that Martha does not owe you anything. The silence stretched on. Finally, Lloyd cleared his throat. I might have made an error, he muttered. I will suspend collection. It was not an apology, but it was a victory. The whispers started before the three of them even left the store. Outside, Martha turned to Elias. You did not have to do that. Yes, I did, he replied. It was the right thing to do. Tom clapped Elias on the shoulder. You know he is going to hate you even more now. Elias smiled. He already hated me. At least now I gave him a good reason. As Elias wheeled back to the boarding house, he noticed the way people looked at him had changed. There was less pity and more respect. That evening, Martha knocked on his door with a basket. I made stew, she said. Too much for one person. They ate together, talking easily about their plans. It was the comfortable chat of two people who had earned each other's trust. After she left, Elias sat in his room, feeling a shift inside him. For the first time, he was in a place that felt less like exile and more like home. He had found people who saw him for what he could do, not for what he could not. Spring came to Red Willow with mud and promise. The snow melted, making the streets difficult to cross. Elias spent his evenings cleaning the mud from his wheelchair, the wheels that kept him working and moving forward. The showdown with Laurie Hutchkins had changed something in the town. He had made waves, just as Tom predicted. But this time the waves were pushing him forward instead of pulling him under. He had stood his ground, and people noticed. Elias's hard work was earning him respect. Folks who once avoided his gaze now gave him a friendly nod. But not everyone was happy for him. Lloyd still shot him hateful looks, and a rancher named Adelaide Pritchard stared him down with pure contempt. Her ranch hand, Carson, a big man with a mean streak, cornered Elias one afternoon. He blocked the boardwalk, forcing Elias to wheel his chair through the thick mud. Carson sneered, "This town has a way of correcting its mistakes." Elias just kept moving, but the threat echoed in his mind. He told Tom about it at the smithy. Tom tried to reassure him. "Carson is all bark and no bite. But you have friends now, Elias. People who would notice if something happened." That means a whole lot in a town like this. What meant even more to Elias was Martha. Their friendship had blossomed into something special. They shared meals and stories, talking about the hard times that had shaped them both. One evening, Martha appeared at his door, looking worried. "I need your help," she said, her hands dusted with flour. The big wash tub at the laundry cracked wide open. Elias grabbed his tools. The tub had a crack nearly 2 feet long, and water was pooling on the floor. "Can you fix it?" Martha asked, her voice full of concern. Elias inspected the damage. Fixing cast iron was a tricky business, especially for holding hot water. "I can fix it," he said, "but it will take time. I need to get supplies from the smithy." Martha's shoulders slumped. "I cannot afford to lose a whole day's work." Elias had an idea. "Use the smaller tub for now. It will be slower, but you will get the work done. I will come fix the big one tomorrow afternoon." "I cannot ask you to do that," she said. "You are not asking. I am offering," he replied, looking her straight in the eye. "We help each other." The next day, Elias got to work. He carefully drained the tub and ground down the edges of the crack. He sealed it with metal patches and a special cement Tom had prepared. Martha worked beside him, and a comfortable quiet settled between them. They were a team, working toward the same goal. It was late when he finished. The next morning they filled the tub, and the repair held perfectly. "It is stronger now where it was broken," Elias said. Martha looked at him, her eyes full of emotion. Just as he was leaving, she stopped him. "Elias, wait. Lloyd came to see me yesterday." Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "He made me an offer," she continued. "He said he would forget my debt and even send business my way. All I had to do was lie. I was supposed to tell everyone that you had been improper with me." The words felt like a punch to the gut. "What did you say?" Elias asked. "I told him to get out of my laundry before I threw him out myself," Martha said, her voice filled with anger. "But you see how he operates. He is trying to ruin your name because he cannot beat you with his own 2 hands. He wants to turn this town against you." She looked at him with urgency. "Maybe we should not be seen together for a while." "No," Elias said firmly. I will not let that coward dictate who my friends are. That is exactly what he wants. If people want to talk, let them talk. We know the truth. A look of resolve washed over Martha's face. You are right, she said. I am tired of letting men like Lloyd control my life with fear. They stood together, a silent promise passing between them. But Lloyd was not done yet. 2 days later, a young boy named Daniel ran into the smithy out of breath. Elias, you have to come quick. There is trouble at the laundry. A crowd was gathered outside. Through the people, Elias could see thick smoke billowing up. He pushed his chair forward as fast as he could. The back porch of the laundry, the one with the ramp he had built for her, was on fire. Tom grabbed the back of his chair. The fire brigade is coming. Let them handle it. That will take too long, Elias shouted, seeing the flames reach for the main building. He wheeled himself to the water pump in Martha's yard and began pumping with all his strength. His shoulders screamed, but he kept filling buckets. His efforts shamed the crowd into action, and they formed a chain, passing the water forward. When Elias's arms gave out, Tom took over the pump, and Elias directed the fight, shouting instructions through the thick smoke. The blaze was mostly contained by the time the fire brigade arrived. The fire captain examined the burned porch steps. This did not start by accident, he said, holding up a broken glass bottle with a cloth stuffed in its neck. This was arson. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Martha's face turned pale. The sheriff arrived and took statements, but seemed unwilling to accuse a prominent citizen. Without witnesses, it is hard to say what happened here, the sheriff said. It was Lloyd Hutchkins, Elias said, his voice clear and loud. He threatened Martha just 2 days ago. He told her she would pay for saying no, and now her business was a pile of ashes. It was no accident, but Lloyd Hutchkins had a solid alibi. The sheriff just shrugged, saying talk was cheap without proof, and that they should let the law handle it. After everyone left, Elias looked at the burned-out porch and blamed himself. He felt he had brought this trouble down on Martha. But Martha's voice was firm. She told him this was Lloyd's doing because he was a small, mean man. She said she would rather fight and lose than just give up. Tom decided they needed to rebuild right then and there. He gathered some men from town, and for the next 4 days they worked on a new porch. Elias, unable to do the heavy work, used his mind. He designed a stronger porch and directed the crew. He proved that his mind was as useful as any man's back. On the 3rd day, Adelaide Pritchard rode by. She stopped just to watch them all working together, with Elias giving orders from his chair. She sneered and said the town was getting soft for helping someone so careless. Martha walked right up to Adelaide's horse. She said if Adelaide had something to say, she should say it plainly. Adelaide warned her that keeping company with Elias was making her a target. She told Martha not to come crying for help when the next disaster hit. After she rode off, a young worker said Adelaide had some nerve. Martha just looked at her friends and the new porch rising from the ashes. She knew more trouble was coming, but her answer was simple. They would just keep on building. By the end of the week, the new porch was finished, stronger and better than before. That evening, Martha fed everyone who helped. Later, as she and Elias cleaned up, she thanked him for not running when things got hard. He promised he was not going anywhere. A deep understanding passed between them, a bond forged in trouble and hard work. The next morning, shouts of another fire sent a chill through Elias. He prayed it was not happening all over again. Tom was already heading for the door. What he saw stopped him cold. It was not Martha's place. It was Lloyd's general store, with thick smoke pouring from the back. Lloyd stood in the street, watching his entire life burn. Suddenly, he pointed right at Elias. "Elias Crow did this!" Lloyd shouted for the whole town to hear. "He burned down my store for revenge." The crowd turned, their eyes full of doubt. Elias spoke clearly over the noise. "I was at Mrs. Chen's boarding house all night. You can ask her, or Daniel, or anyone else staying there." "A convenient alibi," Lloyd snarled back. Sheriff Morrison stepped between them. "We need to put out this fire, not point fingers. There will be time to investigate later." They saved the building's frame, but everything inside was gone. Lloyd's business was a pile of ash. Elias should have felt some satisfaction, a sense of justice. But watching a man lose everything, even a man like Lloyd, brought him no joy. It was just another tragedy. "This was not me," Elias told the sheriff later. "I think someone is trying to make this town tear itself apart." The sheriff nodded slowly. Or maybe someone is showing us how easily things can be broken. The investigation went nowhere, just like the one for Martha's fire. The town was on edge. A few evenings later, as Elias was designing a fire-resistant shed for Martha, a frantic pounding shook his door. It was Daniel. "There has been an accident at the old laundry shack," Daniel said out of breath. "A child is trapped inside, and the building is about to collapse." Elias grabbed his tools and followed Daniel as fast as his chair would go. A crowd had gathered. Through a hole in the wall, Elias could see a little boy, maybe 8 years old, standing on a tiny patch of floor that looked ready to give way. "If that floor goes, he will fall 12 feet onto broken beams," a man explained. "The floor will not hold an adult's weight. Every time someone tries, it starts to break." Elias sized up the situation. An idea, a crazy one, began to form in his mind. "I can get to him," he said. A man looked at him, confused. "No offense, but how?" "My chair," Elias explained. "The wheels will spread my weight across several floor joists, not just one spot." He was already moving toward the door. "I need rope and 2 boards, at least 8 feet long." Tom, a blacksmith, stepped forward. "I will help you. I will tie the rope to your chair. If the floor gives, we will pull you back." They worked fast. Elias rolled to the entrance, looked at the terrified child, and knew this was it. He would save this boy, or they would both go down. Tom secured the rope around Elias's chest with a strong knot. He rolled onto the first board. The wood groaned but held. "What is your name, son?" Elias called out. "Tommy," the boy whispered. "All right, Tommy, I am Elias. I am coming to get you. Just stay right where you are." The boy nodded, his face streaked with tears and dirt. Elias moved his chair forward, just a few inches at a time. The old building groaned around him, protesting every movement. "Elias, that floor is about to go," Tom warned from the doorway. "There is no other way, Tom," Elias said, his voice firm. "That boy is coming out." He was halfway across when he asked, "Tommy, how did you get out there?" "I was looking for bottles," the boy's voice cracked. "Mr. Chen pays 2 cents for bottles. The floor just started breaking." "You did the right thing by staying still," Elias said. He could now see the small island of floorboards Tommy stood on. As he watched, the board shifted, and dust fell into the dark basement below. "We are out of time," Elias called to Tom. "I have to move faster." "You will break through," Tom yelled back. "Then get ready to pull." Elias took a deep breath and pushed his wheels hard. The floor shrieked. Boards snapped to his left, but he kept going. He had to keep his momentum. He reached Tommy just as the section behind him crashed into the basement. The rope pulled tight, but Elias was already reaching for the boy. "Climb on my back," he ordered. "Put your arms around my neck. Now." Tommy scrambled onto the chair, his small arms gripping Elias tightly. The extra weight was too much. The floor beneath them began to give way. "Hold on and do not let go," Elias yelled. Then he shouted to the men at the door, "Pull! Pull now!" The rope went tight, but the floor was collapsing in a wave of destruction. Elias felt his wheels lose their grip as the world fell away beneath them. The floor gave way, and one of the wheels on his chair broke through a rotten plank. Elias was suddenly tipped sideways, with the boy, Tommy, clinging to him. The chair slid toward a gaping hole. Elias yelled for Tom to pull the rope harder. They were dragged violently backward just as the section of floor they were on collapsed into the basement below. Dust and smoke filled the air. A moment later, they were pulled out onto solid ground as the entire front of the building caved in with a terrible roar. Elias sat there, coughing in the dust, with Tommy still wrapped around his neck. They were both alive. The boy's mother ran forward crying and hugging her son. Tom put a hand on Elias's shoulder and told the crowd that this was the man who went in when no one else could. The townspeople looked at the man they had once called useless with new respect. Adelaide Pritchard watched from the edge of the crowd, then turned and walked away without a single word. But Lloyd Hutchkins stepped forward, a nasty smile on his face. He loudly suggested that it was mighty convenient for Elias to become a hero right when people were suspecting him of arson. The crowd shifted, and you could feel the doubt creeping in. Lloyd pointed a finger. "You think I'd risk a child's life for this?" Elias asked, his voice low and hard. "I think you're smart enough to use a bad situation," Lloyd shot back. "The boy gets trapped, you play the hero, and suddenly no one remembers the fires. Mighty convenient, ain't it? Just then, Martha's voice cut through the air like a hot knife. The only thing convenient here is your spite, Lloyd. She stood by Elias, her eyes blazing. I'm done staying quiet. You tried to blackmail me, then you set my laundry on fire. When that didn't work, you blamed Elias for your own store burning down. And now you're using a near tragedy to tear down a man who's shown more decency in a few months than you have in a lifetime. You've done your worst, and we are still here. Mr. Crow saved my son, Tommy's mother said, her voice shaking but firm. That's all I care about. Tom Birch nodded. Me too. Then another voice spoke up, and another. A wave of support washed through the crowd, turning the tide against Lloyd. He looked around, his face turning a deep shade of red, and saw he had lost. Without another word, Tomorrow, he turned and stalked off. As folks started to head home, many stopped to thank Elias. Tommy's mother pushed $2 into his hand. It's all I have, she insisted. Please. He took it, knowing it meant more to her to give it. When the street was empty, Elias, Martha, and Tom stood together, looking at the pile of rubble that had almost been a tomb. Well, that was either the bravest or the dumbest thing I ever saw, Tom said, shaking his head. Probably just dumb, Elias replied, feeling the sharp ache in his ribs. The rope burns were already turning into deep bruises. But I could not just let the boy die. Martha knelt beside him, her hands covering his. You could have been killed in a dozen different ways, Elias. But I was not, he said gently, squeezing her hand. I am right here. She stood up quickly, wiping dust from her skirt. Come on, we are going to the laundry. I need to look at those ribs. On the walk over, Elias noticed folks looked at him differently. It was not pity or curiosity anymore. It was respect. At the laundry, Dr. Kim met them and confirmed nothing was broken. The bruises were bad, but they would heal. After the doctor left, Martha made tea. She set her cup down with a shaky hand. When I saw you run into that fire, she started, I realized I could not bear to lose you. You have become the most important person in my life. Elias listened quietly as she continued. After my husband James died, I built walls around my heart. I decided I was done with love. Then you came along, asking Norlace for a chance to work. You did not try to save me. You just saw me. She took a deep breath, and without even trying, I fell for you. I care for you too, Elias said softly, more than I thought was possible after my accident, after Sarah left. You are more than enough, Elias, Martha said, her voice fierce. You are everything I never knew I was looking for. I want us to be more than friends, she finished. Elias felt a hope he thought was long dead stir inside him. She was not just accepting his limitations. She was embracing all of him. Yes, Martha, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want that too. A genuine, beautiful smile lit up her face. They sat holding hands, two people who had found a way to be whole together. That rescue changed everything in Red Willow. Support for Elias grew strong. In contrast, Lloyd's business dried up. People did not forget his cruelty, and his new shop gathered dust. He was left with almost nothing. A couple of weeks later, Adelaide Pritchard appeared at the smithy. Mr. Crow, she said formally, may I have a word? Outside, she stood tall, struggling with her words. I was wrong about you, she said finally, looking him in the eye. I judged you by that chair. I assumed you were useless, and I apologize. Elias saw only sincere regret in her face. I appreciate that, Mrs. Pritchard. I have a proposition, she continued. I need someone to manage the machinery on my ranch. The job pays twice what Tom gives you, and it includes housing. It was a generous offer, a clear attempt to make things right. Still, Elias hesitated. Thank you, ma'am, but I am happy where I am. I have found a place in this town where I am valued for what I can do, not judged for what I cannot. Adelaide nodded slowly. I understand, but the offer stands if you change your mind. And thank you, Mr. Crow. You showed this whole town what real strength looks like. Back inside, Tom asked, she offer you a job? She did. You taken that? No, I'm staying right here. Tom grinned. Hey, good. I would hate to find another fellow to argue about gears with. That evening, Elias and Martha were by the creek. The spring air was cool and clean. Adelaide offered me a job, he told her, a good one. He saw a flicker of worry in her eyes. Are you going to take it? No, he said, stopping his chair. I told her I was building a life here. In fact, I have been thinking about building a proper workshop. I have saved almost $60. It is a start. He looked at her. I was thinking of building it near your laundry if you would not mind me as a neighbor. Martha stopped and knelt beside his chair, so they were face to face. Elias Crow, I would want you as more than a neighbor. Her eyes were shining. I love you, Elias. I love your stubborn heart and your clever mind. I love that you see me as your partner. I do not want you to build on the property next to mine. I want you to build on our property. Elias felt his throat tighten. Martha, are you asking me to marry you? I am asking you to build a life with me, she whispered. Yes, I want to marry you if you will have me. He let out a laugh full of pure joy. If I will have you. Martha, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Yes, yes to all of it. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that held the promise of a lifetime. Well, Martha said later with a small smile, this will give the town something new to gossip about. A mail-order husband getting hitched to the woman who wasn't on the advertisement. Elias just grinned. Let him talk. They decided on a simple wedding in June. He would keep working with Tom and design his own workshop to be built right there on her property. He spent his evenings drawing up the plans, making sure every workbench and doorway was perfect for him. By May, they broke ground. Tom's crew handled the heavy lifting while Elias managed the finer details. He watched his own space rise from the ground, a place built for him, on land he would share with the woman he loved. Lloyd Hutchkins finally packed his wagon and left Red Willow for good. His reputation was ruined and his business had dried up. As he rode out of town, no one bothered to wave goodbye. 2 days before the wedding, the workshop was finished. It was perfect. On a warm morning in June, Elias and Martha stood by the creek with their closest friends. The local judge came to make it official. Do you, Elias Crow, take this woman to be your wife? I do. And do you, Martha Hale, take this man to be your husband? I do. With a simple, I now pronounce you husband and wife, they kissed as their friends cheered. In that moment, Elias felt a deep sense of peace. He was finally home. Their celebration was simple, with good food and music. As the sun went down, Martha rested her hand on his shoulder. You know, she said softly, this is so much better than the life I once imagined for myself. She smiled. I reckon Adelaide did me a huge favor that day she turned you away. If she hadn't, you'd be miserable on her ranch and I'd still be alone. I guess sometimes life pushes you right where you need to be, even if it hurts at first. Elias thought about the sting of that rejection and how it had led him right here, to this exact spot with this woman. She was right. That painful moment had not been the end of his story. It had been the very beginning. That night, lying beside his wife, Elias thought about what a man is worth. For so long, folks had only seen what he had lost, judging him by the chair he sat in. They saw a broken man. But Martha had shown him the truth. A person's worth is not about being perfect. It is about what you build with the life you are given. It is about the courage to keep going and the grace to find folks who see all of you, broken pieces and all, and love you anyway. He had come to Red Willow with nothing but his tools and a sliver of hope, and he had found everything. In the morning, Elias woke up to the sun on his face and the smell of breakfast. He wheeled into the kitchen and kissed his wife, Martha. 3 years ago, he had woken up in a hospital, his legs useless, his future uncertain. He had been rejected as a mail-order husband because he was disabled. But now he had a good life. He had a workshop, projects for his neighbors, and the respect of the town. As he headed out to his shop, Martha called, "Do not work too late. We are having supper with Tom and Irene." "I will be there," he promised. This was his life now. It was not the one he had planned, but it was the one he had built. He had built it with determination and with the love of a woman who saw him for who he was. Elias Crow was once turned away for being broken, but in that rejection, he found his own strength and a purpose he never expected. He also found a woman who showed him what true love really was. It was not about being perfect. It was about being seen for everything you are, scars and all. It was about building a life with someone who understands that being whole has nothing to do with a perfect body, but everything to do with a present heart. For Elias, the end of one road was just the beginning of a much better one.